Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to have Bill Gates with us this afternoon. I've wanted to do this with you for quite some time. And one of the great privileges in my life as a journalist has actually been getting to know Bill over probably the last decade now, and Warren Buffett together. And every time that we spend time together, I learn so much, and I know so many of you are going to learn so much from Bill. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that Bill Gates is singularly, I would argue, the most consequential individual of our generation. I mean that.
Thank you.
What he did in the private sector at Microsoft changed the face of culture and how we live today. And what he is doing with his foundation is changing the world. I just want to give you one stat. Since 2002, and Bill and Melinda Gates have a huge role in all of this, more than 32 million lives have been saved, and hundreds of millions of people have received prevention treatment and care services for HIV, TB, and malaria as a function of the work that he's been doing. And when you think about 32 million lives, that's something that's very, very difficult for just about anybody else in the world to have done. So thank you for that, Bill Gates. We've been talking about so much today, and I want to talk with Bill about all of that. We were going to talk about his philanthropy, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Warren Buffett, of course, has entrusted his entire fortune to them, and that is a remarkable thing as well. I want to talk about the state of capitalism in America, the politics of where we are, the wealth tax, the debate around philanthropy in this country. Abigail Disney's here. We've been talking about taxes. And the world of technology, and the priorities of the foundation, because I think that they are shifting to a new area around climate change, which I think is fascinating. But here's where I want to start. Let's start and talk a little bit about politics, the politics of this moment. You historically actually have been in favor of a wealth tax, I think.
Of a high estate tax.
Of a high estate tax.
Yeah.
So there is now on the table, Elizabeth Warren has a true wealth tax on the table, 6% for billionaires. It would cost you, I believe, close to $6 billion annually if you had to pay it on top of what you already pay. What do you think of all of this?
Well, I think the span of the two parties in terms of where they are in taxation has never been so broad. You have, one party reducing corporate taxes, still supporting carried interest. Taxes on capital are way, way less than on labor. And the estate tax, they're still talking about, hey, that's a bad thing, that a dead person should pay part of their wealth, and you should reduce these accumulations of wealth. And now, on the other side, you have, as you say, a 6% wealth tax. I happen to believe something in the middle. I think you can make the estate tax higher. You could even take people who've sat on huge gains for, say 10 years and say, okay, you should create a taxation event there. I think just by treating capital income the same as labor income, that goes a very long distance. So I'm all for super progressive tax systems. You do need to couple these things with more transparency. The fact that you can, through trust-like structures, hide lots of beneficial ownership and get away with a lot, both at the corporate level and at the individual level, we can do a lot better there. So I'm impressed that there are a few candidates that go even beyond my view. And I do think if you tax too much, you do risk the capital formation, innovation. U.S. is the desirable place to do innovative companies. I do think you risk that. Now, somebody can say I'm very biased since I've been a prime beneficiary of the existing system. But I'd love somebody to find a middle ground approach, because the government's role in healthcare and better education, the government does need more resources than it has today.
And so what would you do?
Well, if you make the tax on capital the same as labor, you go back to the estate tax that we used to have, doing something like the 10-year thing, where it's super large fortune. The the big fortunes are not, as Piketty says, a return on capital. The big fortunes are the return on creating companies that achieve very strong positions, particularly in the technology industry. That's where you get these super big numbers. And so there, I've paid over $10 billion in taxes. I paid more than anyone in taxes. But I'm glad to have paid, if I'd had to pay $20 billion, it's fine. But when you say I should pay $100 billion, okay, then I'm starting to do a little math about what I have left over. Sorry, I'm just kidding. So you really want the incentive system to be there, and you can go a long ways without threatening that.
Have you ever talked to Elizabeth Warren about any of this before? Would you? Would you want to?
I'm not sure how open-minded she is. Or that she'd even be willing to sit down with somebody, who has large amounts of money.
Okay, so let me make it complicated for you. You've been, politely say, public about your misgivings about our current president. If Elizabeth Warren were the other candidate, what would you do?
I'm not going to, make political declarations, but I do think no matter what policy somebody has in mind, a professional approach is even, as much as I disagree with some of the policy things that are out there, I do think a professional approach to the office, whoever I decide would have the more professional approach in the current situation probably is the thing that I'll weigh the most. And, I hope the more professional candidate is an electable candidate.
Okay, we will, I think we can take away something from that. I have a separate question, actually. This has to do with taxes, though, and it has to do with philanthropy. And one of the great things, and clearly you are an example of it, is that you have given away your vast fortune, $50 billion so far, we should say, and another $50 billion is in the foundation itself. But there has been a question about the idea that vast fortunes in this country are able to be moved from the private sector into a foundation without paying tax. So the shares of Microsoft that you were able to generate, the shares that Warren Buffett was able to generate, there's no capital gains on that. There's no step up on that. And so the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. citizen, it's not clear that they are beneficiaries of your success to the extent you believe that they should be. What do you think of that? Would you ever be in favor of taxing philanthropy in that way of some sort?
We can raise taxes in a lot of ways, including making some gifts to foundations more taxed. We have a lot of room. The current thing is not either in terms of encouraging philanthropy or discouraging and forming new business. We're not close to the limit. I mean, there was a time where we had 70% taxation rates. Now, you do get some people wasting a lot of time looking for tax loopholes if you're not careful there. But, we're not at the limit on that. In my case, because of the amount of money I put in, my deduction expired. You can only take 30% of adjusted gross income. And so 90% of my potential deduction, didn't get used. The way Warren does it, he doesn't have much personal income. So his yearly gift, which is worth over $2.5 billion, he doesn't get that much tax advantage. But both Warren and I are glad in whatever way to pay a fair bit more in taxes. And it is important to separate out the question of, should rich people pay more in taxes? The answer is yes. For whatever remainder of money they have left over, I do think philanthropy is a good thing. I think it plays, that 2% of the economy plays a role that neither the private sector or the government are able to do in terms of various innovative approaches to save malaria or nutrition or trying out new models of education through things like charter schools. So I stick up for even once you change the tax system, the remainder, it's okay, in my view, to have philanthropy.
But what do you think of this larger idea that underneath all of this, you hear people who say there shouldn't be billionaires in society, that if you really understand what this wealth tax is about, in fact, one of our authors at the New York Times describes it almost as a cigarette tax with the ultimate goal of there being less of it.
You know, maybe I'm just too biased to think that if you create a company that's super valuable, that at least some part of that you should be able to have a little bit for consumption and hopefully the balance to do philanthropic things. Now, there are people who think that politically those fortunes being used for things like lobbying or giving to candidates, that's tilting the playing field. You know, the last election was not, or at least the presidential piece, was not a money-driven phenomena. You know, the candidate who spent more did not win in that case. But I agree, the First Amendment wasn't designed at a time when rich people could essentially buy this big megaphone. I choose not to participate in large political donations. There are times it might feel tempting to do so, and you know, there are other people who choose to do so, but I just don't want to grab that gigantic megaphone.
Okay, but let me ask you then about this. And this is the author of Winner Takes All. You know this book. You know who I'm talking about. He says, as the author says, they make gigantic piles of money. This is people of great wealth, and have tricked politicians and the media into giving them an exceptionally loud voice in policy discussion. There's still a question of should any one person, however amazing, have that much say over public life. What do you think of that idea?
Well, we have a democracy, which is one person, one vote. And certainly the democracy is not electing all people that I vote for. And I do think it's okay to talk to experts. You know, during Brexit, there was a person who said, you know, we've had enough of experts. I do think that if you want to talk about software innovation, that at least listening to the ideas of people who've been successful in that area isn't such a bad thing. I mean, you literally say that we can't talk to politicians if you really think that sharing our opinions about, say, climate change or malaria or malnutrition or charter schools, you know, if that's really bad, you know, this group does have more free time. They have proven that, you know, they're energetic, can solve some things, and often they get into a phase of their life, like Steve Schwartzman is putting a lot of his energy and thought into very creative, and I think what will be positively impactful philanthropy.
And we just saw Steve, who I think is still here, I hope. Let me ask you a maybe tough question, and this has to do with the idea that philanthropy today often feels, or people would argue, that it credentializes people. It credentializes certain people. There have been a number of reports, including in the New York Times, and you know where I'm going with this, about a handful of meetings, if not more, that you took with Jeffrey Epstein after he had been convicted as a sexual offender. And I know that you have said it was a mistake and that it was something that you wished you had not done in retrospect. But I'm curious now, with hindsight, since those stories came out, what you think the lesson of that was. And when you think about that as an experience and this credentializing idea.
Well, definitely, you know, any people with a reputation spending time with him probably gave him an undeserved sense of, you know, being back in the mainstream or not being a pariah. And so my doing that was a mistake. As I go about trying to raise money for global health, which, you know, every extra $1,000 we raise for that cause saves one life. And so we are extremely resource limited. We can buy more bed nets, we can buy more vaccines. In that case, you know, I made a mistake in judgment that I thought that those discussions would lead literally to billions of dollars going to global health. Turned out that was a bad judgment. That was a mirage. None of that money ever appeared. And I gave him some benefit by the association. So I made a doubly wrong mistake there. In general, when we have something like the Giving Pledge, it is tricky when, you know, somebody wants to sign up and you're like, well, but your fortune is really a questionable fortune. There's some countries that we just haven't done any recruiting in at all because we're not, in a position to really make those
Because
judgments.
because you look and you see the corruption.
Yes, that it may have been derived improperly. And I feel bad. We probably will at some point accept someone into the giving pledge, and it'll turn out that their fortune is a disreputable fortune. It is, as you're engaging in this, if you really want to get out there and get more people drawn into philanthropy, there is a risk that you'll make a mistake.
Let me ask you a personal question. And I was thinking about this the other day because I wrote an article about you several years ago, and we, for the New York Times Magazine, it was the cover. It was an education piece, you remember. And we were walking down the street on 57th Street, and we maybe walked half a block, and you were surrounded. And there was a moment where I thought, when we were walking, that you had forgotten that you were Bill Gates. And maybe just stick with me for a second. And I wonder, just in your life, you are the equivalent in some ways of a head of state these days in terms of, your time down to the minute. There's a whole thousands of people around you. And I just wonder, on a very personal level, when you think about your own life, how you can be Bill Gates out there in the world, and then how you can be the Bill Gates that you are in private. And how you think about that, and how you maybe even how you can find some space between the two.
Well, part of it is that you limit the amount of time you go out into the world because it's a little bit distortive, and you have people around you like Warren Buffett or my wife Melinda, who, if I come back and I look like I'm all puffed up, they, cut me down to size a little bit. And, I do the dishes, I have kids.
Do you?
Well, absolutely.
You do the dishes?
I drive kids to school. I have kids that think I don't see the world in a modern enough way, including even some technology things they use that they find it amazing.
Like what?
Oh, I'm not as phone-centric as they are. I mean, I have to tell myself, I've got to check Instagram because my youngest daughter likes to communicate there. I have to check WhatsApp because another child likes to communicate through that. It's like, oh my God, I have to do all this. But if I forget to do it, then it's like, wow, you're not paying attention to my life. I like to read email, and it bugs them that I'm so email-centric and that I'm very large screen oriented. So going out, just take like today. Today I got to meet top scientists working on solving malnutrition and obesity. I got to meet top scientists working on gene editing, which for some disease of the poor like sickle cell or HIV cure will make a big difference. So I get a huge benefit when I go out in public of these interactions of how can we drive things forward. So the idea that, okay, I give up some privacy in certain settings, as long as it's not when I'm with my kids, it's fine. It's part of the deal. I don't go into a bar all that much because then people are even more aggressive about coming up and talking, and that's probably good that I stay away.
I want to talk about the foundation, but you just mentioned technology, so let me just ask you about it, because we had Macon Del Rahim earlier here today, and we've been talking about antitrust, and you, of course, lived through the case, and Dave Marcus from Facebook is here today. I'm curious how you see these cases or this question about big tech today, and this idea that some of these companies, given their platform, can advantage or disadvantage their products over others, given what took place, and when you sort of look at what happened with Microsoft and Netscape years ago.
Well, I'm not sure whether the only tool being breaking companies up is either valid the way the law is written or is likely to be written. I think it's probably more fruitful to look at the network effects that you get, that say if you send a friend's message to somebody, if they're not on that particular network, it can't get to them. Or if you're shopping on Amazon, they have your credit card, they have your shipping address, they have your history. Should there be a regulation like there is in Europe for the financial institutions, where if you want to share all of your information, about what you do with bank one, with bank two, so you can get them to bid to give you a loan, that's required, that the network effects that you might have of being locked into the one bank, these interoperability rules. So I do think there are things about technology companies that it's worth looking at what the policy should be. I'm not sure, but believe me, there's another one where you can say I'm just super biased. I didn't think Microsoft should be broken up. I argued against it, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
Do you think it made the technology environment more competitive?
No, I think that's one of the, but everyone else can say that if they want. It's not true to me, and I will never change that opinion.
I think that we've talked before where there was a view that maybe the case, and maybe it's the case itself, might have taken the company's eye off the ball around mobile, might have given
it definitely did
given Google an opportunity.
But that doesn't help. That's not a pro-consumer thing. There's no doubt that the antitrust lawsuit was bad for Microsoft, and we would have been more focused on creating the phone operating system. And so instead of using Android today, you would be using Windows Mobile. If it hadn't been for the antitrust case, Microsoft would have gone, oh, we were so close. I was just too distracted. I screwed that up because of the distraction. And we were just 3 months too late with the release that Motorola would have used on a phone. So yes, it's a winner-take-all game, that is for sure. That now nobody here's ever heard of Windows Mobile. But oh well. And I wouldn't, that's a few $100 billion here or there. I wouldn't have retired as soon. And that one is less, I am disappointed that Windows Mobile didn't succeed. But in terms of my own life, even though it was a very painful thing because I got very personally involved in the defense of the company, the fact that I retired earlier probably net was good for me because I got down the learning curve on the foundation. I got to partner with Melinda in the early days of the foundation. And I don't have a life where I'm allowed to complain because basically, only 99% of things have worked out very, very well.
Let me ask you two other quick tech-oriented questions. Do you have a take on this political advertising issue right now that's taking place on social media?
I think that targeting, in that domain, essentially targeting should not be allowed.
Should not be allowed?
Not be allowed.
But do you think that the content should be policed or not?
I wish I thought there was such a thing that could be done. But no, I actually disagree with targeting, but I disagree with people who think that a corporation should sit there and do fact-checking against those things. Yes, there are extreme cases somebody can come up with, like Holocaust denial or various things. But no private company can or should make those judgments. It's the targeting where you don't see the hate ad that just appeals to that one person. It's the targeting that's really screwed this thing up, according to me.
Let me ask you a separate question, because I was thinking about you the other day when I was thinking about Facebook. You made an interesting decision when you started Microsoft not to have a dual-class share. And so many of these Silicon Valley companies do today. What do you think of that?
I think it's a mistake, and I've said that to everyone who's asked me. It's enough as an individual to really feel like you're responsible for the success of a company to actually go and short-circuit the governance mechanism where if you really are making mistakes that your board can't outvote you, that you literally can just replace the board the next day. Well, how kind of hubris is that? I mean, if you're really doing a good job, you really think you're at risk of that? I felt enough responsibility for making sure Microsoft succeeded that I didn't want to be the dictator of Microsoft.
Okay, final tech-oriented question, because I know it's a sort of a geopolitical question, then we talk about the foundation, which is China, which has not actually come up too much today, unfortunately. But I'm curious where you land on Huawei and this idea that China is building technology that ultimately is going to compete, if not overtake, what we're doing here.
It's good that China's doing innovative technology, and anybody who thinks we should try and stop that is A, being unrealistic, and B, it's not a good thing. Huawei, like all goods and services, should be subject to an objective test. Is it bugged or not bugged? The rule that everything that comes from China is bad if it tries to come to the US, or everything from the US, like jet engines, software, you name it, is bad. That is one crazy approach to trying to take advantage of innovation and really have the two countries mutually dependent enough that we minimize the chance of ever going to war with each other. We should take advantage of their climate change innovations, their medical innovations, just like they should take advantage of ours. And the idea that we just, you can do things with an objective standard. When we were questioned about, does Windows have some NSA thing in it, we gave to governments the Windows source code, and they could look at it, they could compare it to what was shipped. We created an openness that made them comfortable enough, and Huawei can do the same thing. But if you ever want to
The government doesn't think so at the moment, this administration.
Anyone with technical expertise would think so. How can you tell China to buy a jet engine? The jet engine has all sorts of software in it. Now, you can send a funny command to it and say, okay, turn off the jet engine. Do you want them to buy any of our sophisticated goods and products or not? And what about Chinese employees? If you're so paranoid, what about the code that's being written by somebody whose grandmother was Chinese? I mean, or great-grandmother was Chinese. My God, just think about it. I mean, is there any piece of software in the world that you're willing to trust? You should use objective measures, not taint-type measures. There are people born in foreign countries who write software, honest to God.
Let me pivot the conversation to the foundation, because you're doing something very interesting to me, which is that, and I don't want to say that you're pivoting, but I think that there's been a shift for you, which is that you focus thus far on global health. And by the way, Nick Kristof, my great colleague, was one of the great inspirations, a column that he wrote for some of the work that you've done. But what I wanted to ask you about is, you seem to be shifting your money, resources, thought, and efforts towards climate. And I want to understand when that happened for you, what the change was, and how you see the challenge.
Yeah, actually, I'm working on a book that'll come out next summer about what a climate solution would look like. And I've been pleased that the interest level in climate has gone up pretty dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years. It was about 10 years ago, I had some professors come to me 4 or 5 times a year and bring other experts so I could learn, okay, how good are the models? What are the negative effects? What is the uncertainty? What are the positive feedback cycles? And so I've been on this learning curve, and that's the whole reason I started this nuclear power company called TerraPower, was not to make money, and I've avoided that. But although the artificial meat companies I put money into, I'm going to make more from those than I lost in the other ones. But so the climate is this really tough problem to change the whole industrial infrastructure. There are 2 issues in climate. One is called mitigation, where you're doing work to reduce the emissions, which is currently 53 billion tons a year. Everybody agrees you've got to get that pretty close to 0 by 2050. I do that outside the foundation through investments in private companies. People who do geothermal, offshore wind, electric buses. I even have a venture fund that 20 other people have supported to invest in these climate-related innovations. The other climate thing you have to do is called adaptation. That is, help the people who will still be affected, because the temperature is going to go up somewhere between 2 degrees, 3 degrees centigrade and 4 degrees centigrade. And it's hard to say what. We'll have to do a super, super good job to get anywhere near to the 2 degrees. And so the poor farmers in the equatorial regions will have more failed crops. You'll also have more storms, you have sea level rise. And so that's where the foundation is trying to create seeds that can deal with drought, that are more productive for the good years, so you have buffer stock. So we're doing a lot of adaptation work. A lot of it's the work we would do anyway, of improving nutrition, improving agricultural output. The weather is already very uncertain. It just gets worse in a negative way.
Do you think politically nuclear power will ever be something that will be a completely viable solution? Because it solves a lot of the problems.
If people were rational, yes, which means there's like a 30% chance. Nuclear, the current reactors actually have a better safety record than any other source of electricity. They are not the best.
Except that when there is a problem, there's a problem.
Chernobyl is the only case where you have radiation release killing people. Coal kills a lot of people. Natural gas pipelines blow up and kill people. Per kilowatt hour, it's the safest. But I don't care about that. Those reactors can blow up. You can design a reactor that is not capable. That is, there's no high pressure in the reactor anywhere. These existing reactors have lots of high pressure, and they need humans sitting there pushing buttons. You can design a reactor that by multiple physics principles, that the radioactive material never leaves the reactor. You have, the heat pool and the low pressure anyway. And so people at least should be open-minded that a next generation reactor can have far better economics, far better safety, no proliferation, no waste problem. But we need lots of innovations to solve climate change. If we have certain other breakthroughs like in energy storage, you can actually create a zero-emission grid without nuclear. But it's way more straightforward. It's way less expensive. It's way quicker if a meaningful part of it is this breakthrough new generation reactor.
What's the coolest technology or thing that makes you the most optimistic?
Well, the thing that is the most amazing is that part of the reason poor countries have such a tight time is that over 40% of the kids there never develop either their physical body or their brain. Because of malnourishment from an early age, they have very low IQ, very low physical capacity. And so in Africa, that's over 40% of the kids. And it's never been understood why. It's not like starvation. They are getting enough feed. Their twin brother is on their growth path, and they're not. We've discovered, the foundation's researchers we fund, that you get inflammation in your stomach that relates to the bacterial species, the so-called microbiome. And so we are in trials right now with very low-cost things that can get rid of that inflammation and allow the kid to get back on their growth path. And so not only will less kids die, because kids on their growth path are a third as likely to die from pneumonia or diarrhea or malaria, but also as the kids survive, their ability to learn and do work. Every society has benefited from the fact that the food input, you got more and more protein, and so less kids had malnourishment. Here we can short circuit that, and even very poor countries, we can essentially get rid of malnutrition. I get to work on a lot of cool things. That is the most cool thing I'm working on.
How close? I know you were so close on polio and malaria.
Well, polio we're close. Malaria is a 20 to 30-year quest that we're just at the beginning of. Polio, hopefully we're not many years away from getting 0 cases. We have 2 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I'm putting a lot of time into that because 0 is a magic number. As long as there's cases in those 2 countries, it can spread back. And so we have to keep vaccinating kids all around the world because it could go anywhere. If we can get to 0, then you can stop vaccinating, and it's like smallpox, the only disease ever eradicated. We don't spend any money on treating people or vaccinating people because it's gone.
Do you have any interest in space?
No.
Well, your neighbor in Seattle likes space.
He can have it.
Why is that?
Because malnutrition is so much more impactful. HIV is more impactful. Malaria is more impactful.
Have you ever talked to Jeff about that?
Oh, sure. Elon likes Mars. Jeff likes artificial planets. I read a lot of science fiction, but I guess not as much as they did.
2 final questions. And one came from an audience member as I was walking back in here earlier today. They want to know, would you ever run for president?
No.
Ever?
No.
Not interesting.
Well, I am good at innovation, backing scientists, whether it's climate change or HIV or malnutrition. That's what I'm good at. And it's very much a full-time job, orchestrating the resources, and then when there's a breakthrough, making sure it gets out to all the kids in the world who need it. This work that I do in partnership with Melinda and a great team at the foundation and many other co-funders. This is my life's work. This is my current life's work. I have 2 careers, my Microsoft career and this career. And it will take all of the years I have remaining to make big progress, for example, to get rid of malaria and to get childhood death in poor countries so that it's not any greater than in rich countries. That's the sort of equity goal, less than 1% of children dying, which today is still 5% on a global basis. That's the thing that I'll put all my remaining energy into.
When we walked out here, before we did, we showed a video of you and Warren Buffett, and you made that video for him. I always loved watching that video, and that's why I wanted to show it to everybody. But can you just tell us about this friendship? And I've gotten to see you guys together, but the reason I ask is it's kind of a coincidence of sorts.
Absolutely.
That 2 of the wealthiest people in the world become best friends. And I'm not sure it has anything to do with the money, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, certainly not. And I didn't even want to meet Warren because I thought, hey, this guy buys and sells things, and so he found imperfections in terms of markets. That's not value added to society. That's a zero-sum game that is almost parasitic. That was my view before I met him. And no, he wasn't going to tell me about inventing something. But then I meet him, and I realize that everything he does is based on a framework of the world where he's judging markets, judging people, judging how things work in a very deep way. And so he asked me questions about Microsoft, like, why can't IBM crush you in a second? That is the world's most obvious question, and nobody had ever asked me before. And so I got to ask him about newspapers and retailers and good investments, bad investments, and how he figured all that out. And I realized we both, although we come from different places, we're both trying to model the world and what goes on. And the world, I have to say, has been even more fascinating in some unexpected ways than when we first became friends. A number of things Warren and I call each other up and go, oh my God, can you believe what's going on? This is so interesting, unexpected. What the hell's going to happen? We can talk, forever because we're both trying to figure it out.
Final question. What do you want to be remembered for when all this is over?
Well, I certainly don't have a goal to be remembered. I want to work on things that, in a sense, people will forget. I want you to forget there was ever polio or malaria. Now, there are a few people I would like to remember me, my children, my grandchildren, and I hope they remember me favorably. But outside that pretty small group, if you really get rid of problems, then nobody ever has to think about it again.